Today is December 30, 2016, and we're coming close to the end of Hanukkah. But we've been studying the writings of Josephus, in particular Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, and the last thing that we read was the end of chapter 7. So let us ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Todah Lakal, thank you for everything. Todah La'emet, thank you for truth. We come to you now, Heavenly Family, thanking you for this Sabbath, knowing that you want to guide us to understand the principles of truth. And I just want to thank you for our discussions during this feast of Hanukkah, and thank you for the discussion that we had last night talking about various principles. Please help us to understand more and guide us as we discuss and review this history that we've been looking at and how it relates to the principles which also apply today. Please help us to really get it and to move beyond theory to practicality. So, Todah, thank you. We ask these things b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen. Yeah. All right, so as I already mentioned, we've been looking at Antiquities of the Jews written by Josephus, and the last thing that we read was Book 12, Chapter 7, which is the section, and especially the last two paragraphs, actually. So, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 7, paragraphs 6 and 7. That is the particular spot that describes the Feast of Hanukkah itself. The cleansing of the temple in the year 165 BC, the dedication of it, and the reinstitution of the sacrificial service, along with the celebration of the restoration of the temple, which lasted for 8 days, and the law which was made that such a celebration would be observed every year. And so that is essentially the story of Hanukkah. So the next thing to read is chapter 8, paragraph 1. But before we go on to that, I know last night when we discussed some of these things, we started with elements more particularly focused on what we've been reading, and then it ended up going to principles beyond that, which was a great thing, really. I mean, we want to understand all of these various principles, and so last night we didn't end up actually reading anything here from Antiquities of the Jews, and that was all right. So I would like to ask if anyone has any further comments or questions on what we were discussing last night, or on what we have read already in Antiquities of the Jews concerning Hanukkah and the period of time and all of that. And if not, as in if there are no other comments or questions, then we will get into reading chapter 8. So, anyone?
I don't have any questions right now, so it's just continue, I guess, for me.
Okay, sure. Everyone else cool with that?
Yes. We're good.
Okay. So, if someone would like to volunteer to read the first paragraph, that would be great. And also, since it's the beginning of a chapter, if you could read the heading of the chapter as well, that would be wonderful.
I'll give it a go. Chapter 8, How Judas Subdued the Nations Round About, and how Simon beat the people of Tyre and Ptolemais, and how Judas overcame Timotheus and forced him to fly away, and did many other things after Joseph and Azarias had been beaten. Paragraph 1. When these things were over, the nations round about the Jews were very uneasy at the rival of their power, and rose up together and destroyed many of them, as gaining advantage over them by laying snares for them, and making secret conspiracies against them. Judas made perpetual expeditions against these men, and endeavored to restrain them from those incursions, and to prevent the mischiefs they did to the Jews. So he fell upon the Idumeans, the posterity of Esau, and Acrabaton, and slew a great many of them, and took their spoils. He also shut up the sons of Bean that laid wait for the Jews, and he sat down about them and besieged them, and burnt their towers and destroyed the men that were in them. After this he went thence in haste against the Ammonites, who had a great and numerous army, of which Timotheus was the commander. And when he had subdued them, he seized on the city Jazer, and took their wives and their children captives, burnt the city, and then returned into Judea. But when the neighboring nations understood that he was returned, they got together in great numbers in the land of Gilead, and came against those Jews that were at their borders, who then fled to the garrison of Dathema, and sent to Judas to inform him that Timotheus was endeavoring to take the place whither they were fled. And these epistles were reading, there came other messengers out of Galilee, who informed him that the inhabitants of Ptolemais and of Tyre and Sidon and strangers of Galilee were gotten together.
All right. Any comments or questions? Well, something that comes to my mind is that John was right. No surprise there. John had mentioned how it seems as though, looking at Josephus and looking at history, there's this cycle of war, peace, and it keeps on going like that. And all right, well, the last thing that we read was, victory, getting the temple back and celebrating, and it's good. So we can basically expect that the next thing is going to be more war, and unfortunately that's what it is. So that's something that stood out to me, that, hey, look, the pattern evidently continues on. But I want to make sure that everyone understands what's happening here. So would someone like to just kind of repeat in their own words what they understand this paragraph to be saying?
Well, part of it was because here the Jews had revived a lot of their power, and the nations around them were very jealous and uneasy, I'm sure, about that. And then they started doing sneaky things like says laying snares for them and secret conspiracies against them, and so they probably knocked off quite a few Jews in that way. And then Judas, he started sending out, I'm sure, groups of men, expeditions, it says, against the men that were laying the snares, if I understand that correctly. And then he was trying to prevent them from doing what had been happening to the Jews. So then he goes out and he, it says he falls upon the Idumeans. And I never even heard of that group, but evidently they're generations down from Esau. So he really got rid of a lot of the enemies that way. And then I have a question on that 1, 2, 3, 4. This sentence down towards the, well, you said the sentences are different. Well, the next thought after what I just said was, he shut up the sons of being that laid wait for the Jews, and he sat down upon them. I've never really heard that expression, shut up the sons of being. It sounds like maybe he cornered them, maybe, caused them not to have a way of escape, possibly. Do you think that might be what that was?
That could be, or basically put a stop to them, or something along those lines. I myself don't know, the specific meaning of the expression, but
yeah,
definitely
I totally
something along those general lines.
Mm-hmm. At first, I just totally didn't understand it at all. And then I got thinking, well, right after it says, he shut up the sons of being that laid wait for the Jews, and he sat down upon them and besieged them and burnt their towers. Well, they must not have had any way of escape. Maybe they were between, some hills or something. Well, anyway, he destroyed quite a number of them in very messy ways, and then he just goes on to other nations. Timotheus was commander of one of them, and he subdued them, and they go on to another city, and let's see. But when the neighboring nations understood that he was returned, they got together in great numbers in the land of Gilead and came against those Jews that were at their borders, who then fled to the garrison of Zephima and sent to Judas to inform him that Timotheus was endeavoring to take the place where they were fled. So that was a pretty big deal there. But it's a pretty long sentence, too, with a lot of thought in there, so we might need to discuss that more. So it just, like he just went on from one to another, keeping the ground that they had gained. Is that what it sounds like to you?
Yeah, it generally sounds like, here they are, they've regained however much territory and are celebrating, and, they regained the temple, and so the Jewish people are being established again, and other people aren't happy about it. They become uneasy because, hey, this is a rival power, and so then they try to come and destroy them, and they would, there were various peoples who came, and Judas Maccabeus basically was victor in all of these confrontations. There are a couple things that come to my mind with this. One of the things that I find amazing is just how many times other nations sought to destroy the Jewish people. Like, it would be quite the project to go through all the historical records and count how many times that has happened in the history of the world. I mean, it's happened so many times with so many nations, and it's just a really bizarre thing when you think about it, how many times people have tried to destroy the Jewish people. And I remember...
When you're through, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, and, this still hasn't ended today. There's still many people who would like to destroy the Jewish people. Obviously, the most obvious modern example of this is the Holocaust. And I'll mention something that I mentioned recently, how, Martin Luther, he called for the extermination of the Jews even. And there were many things, different Catholic edicts and so on over the centuries that, forced Jews into ghettos and different things like that. And But, Martin Luther, and even like at the very end of his life is when he made his most decided statements against Jews. And it's just horrible reading some of the things that he wrote, and he's calling to burn down their synagogues and destroy their writings. And he said something about how, we fail of doing our duty if we don't kill them, and just really, really horrible stuff. And that influenced German thought for a long time. And one of Luther's writings, the one which is most specifically against Jews and which called for the burning of synagogues and doing quite a number of things against Jews, giving them no rights and so on, that was a book that was published and advocated and everything by the Nazi Party in Germany, and he had a clear influence on Hitler and the Nazis, and they carried out Martin Luther's wishes. And it's like, oh man, it's so horrible. It's the same sort of thing. You look at Antiochus Epiphanes wanting to wipe out the Jews. You look at the story in 3rd Maccabees about Jews in Egypt, and the king at that time just wanted to wipe out the Jews. And it's just happened so many times. It's really, really insane.
So in context, into this paragraph, we're set up again. So Judas has gotten information from his messengers that once again several nations have gathered together to attack.
Yeah, unfortunately. So what was it that you were wanting to say, Mom?
Oh, about everyone trying to destroy the Jews. When I was first aware of, as I was growing up and hearing stories about the, Holocaust and many other people really down on the Jews, everyone that ever mentioned it to me always referred to, the reason everyone hates the Jews is because they killed Christ. And that's not so, because, like you said, Trent, it went on since the history of the world. And I was never aware of these happenings way, way, way before, the time of Christ even. And, of course, after, as well. But I just always thought it was the main reason the rest of the world didn't like the Jews was because they had killed Christ, and the blessing that wasn't taken away from them was the ability to make money, and a lot of people considered them a little bit on the shady side, and for whatever reason, they just didn't like them. But not according to this history, is it?
Well, what it shows is that hatred of Jews certainly begun before the time of Jesus. However, I will say that anti-Semitism as we know it today is as a result of Christianity, because it ended up the reasons for which Jews were hated and the extent to which Jews were hated certainly changed post-Christianity. And, in ancient times, the Jewish people were viewed as a nuisance for various reasons. I mean, some people, at first it was just, hey, let's wipe these people out because they are in a good location and we want that territory. So it was primarily about territory at first. And then it became, this people, they just want to keep their own ways, and especially when the Greeks took over and had the thought in mind of, hey, let us make basically everyone into Greeks. and certain Jews refused to do that, then those Jews which refused to do that were hated for that reason. But not all Jews were hated. It's just the Jews who had refused to become Greeks. And so they weren't hated because of their religion per se. They weren't hated for something they'd done or their nature. They were just hated because of being, quote-unquote, stubborn and unwilling to cooperate. Now, when Christianity arose, the interpretation of Christianity of certain passages in the Gospels and so on was very anti-Jewish, and it did become about the fact that Jews killed Jesus. And, throughout Christian history, the innocence of Pilate and the Romans was emphasized more and more, and the guiltiness of the Jews was emphasized more and more. In the Gospels, the way it's presented is as basically a joint effort between, it was basically, in all the Gospels, Jesus was killed by Romans, but it was instigated by certain elements in Jewish leadership. In later history, again, Pilate and the Romans became increasingly viewed as innocent and Jews as guilty, and things were emphasized such as, let his blood be on us and on our children. That was emphasized so much to say, oh, the Jews are just wicked. And so the view of Jews that you end up having, let's say, in Martin Luther's mind, or in Dark Ages, Roman Catholic thinking and so on, is something that does go far beyond Antiochus Epiphanes or all these different surrounding nations. Sure, yeah, they wanted to kill the Jews. They wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. And so in what you're saying, Mom, it's correct. It didn't start after. It actually started before. And so that's not, the fact that they killed Jesus is not the only thing or whatever it may be. It's not the original reason as to why people wanted to wipe out Jews. But that did become the primary reason. And, it's but not the only reason. I mean, one of the things, like when you read what Luther had to say about the Jews, he goes on and on about how they're so proud and so boastful and, basically so proud about their lineage going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so boastful that they were not, and he cited Jewish prayers, thanking God that, I'm trying to remember the three elements. One was thanking God that we are not Gentiles, thanking God that we are not women, and thanking God that we're not something else. So it's like, and it's a Jewish prayer. Sorry, what was that?
Didn't that one guy in the temple say he was thankful that he wasn't like other men?
That's a different thing. That's this was something else. It's three specific things that have actually been a part of Jewish prayers. And what Luther pointed out is that, hey, this isn't something that started with Jews. Plato actually prayed like that, thanking for those three specific things. But he was using this to just say that Jews are just wicked. And, he had tried earlier on in his ministry, he had tried to convert Jews to Christianity, but basically failed. And so he was saying how, it's impossible to convert them, and they're just wicked, and all of these things. And, basically said that there's no other solution to the quote-unquote Jewish problem other than basically ridding them from our nation. So, yeah, pretty horrible.
You know what I could never understand, if I could ask a question on that topic, is like I know Christians today, or many of them anyway, have a lot of sympathy for the Jews. Obviously, they're thankful, that Jesus Christ came from their lineage. And then, I guess I'm just wondering, just the whole idea of cheap grace and how Jesus had to die to pay for our sins, again, which means that somebody had to kill Jesus, and the Jews kind of did it. I mean, just in my whole life, obviously misunderstanding that, I had always been confused as why people hate the Jews for killing Jesus, because that's what was supposed to happen. And so I was kind of, glad they did it, kind of. And I had never thought that I wouldn't have. I'm sure I would have been, yelling "Crucify him" with misunderstanding, like most of them did. Maybe not, hopefully not, but probably would have. So I don't know where they get that. I mean, how are they going to be saved? I mean, when did the idea of cheap grace even come into being, I guess, is the question. Did it come in with Luther? I think people think it did. I mean, I kind of thought that the idea of cheap grace, meaning that Jesus died to pay it all, so you can just try your hardest and, just live your best life, and it's okay as long as you say the sinner's prayer. Jesus paid the penalty for your sins, so it's all good. When did that theory of salvation come into being?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think different versions of it have been around for a long time, going back probably to the 2nd century of the Common Era, with certain Gnostic groups which taught that, being saved isn't about not sinning and so on. But I don't know if they had the idea that basically God looks at Jesus rather than looking at you, and looks at Jesus' life as though it's your life. I don't know if they had that specific aspect. But I know that Augustine, who had been a Manichaean Gnostic, he taught that basically you just have to keep sinning. But he also taught that he was saved. He believed he was saved, and that all Christians, true Christians, were saved, but that you keep sinning, but that doesn't mean that you're not saved. So obviously there's some form of cheap grace in the days of Augustine, and I think that he probably got that from his Gnostic roots, because again, in Gnosticism, it's about being liberated from the physical world, not about basically actually keeping the law. But it's not unique to just Gnosticism. I think probably what became Orthodox Christianity ended up having some version of cheap grace very early on too, because they started discarding the law. And once the law is being discarded, then righteousness is being tossed away, and therefore what else do you have? Basically it ends up being cheap grace. But in its more contemporary form, I don't know exactly when or where it started, if it started with Martin Luther or after. I read a couple quotes from Martin Luther recently that someone was using to make it look like he's promoting cheap grace, but I'd have to go and actually read the whole context. But basically in the statements, the way that it was being presented anyway, he was basically saying how, we must sin in this life, and but our sins aren't really sin because we're in Jesus, and in him there is no sin, and that basically, like Luther was saying something like, I find certain sins and I commit them fully in order to taunt the devil, or something like that. And when the devil tells me not to drink strong drink, I do it all the more in order to spite him, and something like that. But again, that would have to be read to see, like, okay, was someone misrepresenting this, or like, is that a misrepresented quote, or is that actually what he said and what he meant? If he really did mean it the way that it sounds from that, then it certainly would seem as though he had a version of cheap grace. But again, yeah, I have not read much of Luther's writings, so I wouldn't be able to actually say one way or the other. So that's kind of, I would say that the origins of it go back at least into the 2nd century of the Common Era. And in its more modern form, it probably developed within Protestantism, whether it was Luther or another reformer or someone after that. And so, yeah, I don't know the exact origins, but those are kind of the periods of revival of the idea.
Interesting. Yeah, because as a Catholic, you're really not taught to break the law. The law has been changed. Of course, you don't know that. But, there's really that concept of cheap grace that I remember was not really taught to me as a Catholic growing up. So, I just always assumed it started with Luther. And then I was always just confused why people were so mad at the Jews, because they killed Jesus and somebody had to, so we should be thanking them. Anyway.
Right. And on that element, it is really interesting how, especially Protestant Christianity, has changed from really hating Jews to really loving Jews. And now, evangelical Christendom has a lot of pro-Judaism. And that probably has a lot to do with the state of Israel being established and all of that. And, it probably has more so to do with prophetic interpretation than it has to do with anything else.
Right.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
So any other comments or questions?
Paul said some things that could kind of confuse people too. The things I want to do, I don't do. The things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do, I do.
Right, yeah, people are often confused by Romans 7. Now, I would say, though, that in just reading all of Romans together, his point becomes quite plain. And so, that's why I'm saying, we'd have to read what Luther's saying, because, hey, if Luther was actually, let's say he was saying those things, but he was specifically trying to show a false way of thinking, well, then obviously that wouldn't be his perspective. Or if he was trying to show how he thought in the past or something like that, well, that would be, understandable. But if he's just simply promoting that way of thinking, then that would be a problem. But, these are things that we'll have to, in order to really understand it, we'd have to look at it from his own perspective, so to speak. One element of the paragraph that we read that may be the part that people would like to discuss the least is this part. It says, and when he had subdued them, referring to the Ammonites, he seized on the city Jazer and took their wives and their children captives and burnt the city and then returned into Judea. And, this is a type of statement, and of course the part that I'm focusing on is taking captive the wives and the children. We read this sort of thing all the time in the Old Testament. It's not like it's a new thing. And it might be that people just passed over it without even really noticing it, or just, thinking, well, I guess that's just the way things were done back then. And in a sense, it was just the way things were done back then. But I think, I don't really know all the things to say or not say concerning statements like this. But, if we were to read this and it was to do with any other people that we don't have a particular affinity with, like let's say we're reading the history of the Romans and it's talking about the Romans going different places and, taking women and children captive and burning a city and all of that, we would read that and automatically think, oh, how awful. Like, taking women and children captive, it's just awful, And when we read it in the Bible, or when we read it here even, in relation to Jews doing this, for some reason we don't think the same thoughts. So we have a special exception for Jews doing this, or Joshua son of Nun and leading the Israelites doing something like this, and that's something that is obviously a problem. And you can see how someone, let's say, who doesn't have that affinity would see that and say, hey, wait a second, why don't you have a problem with that? Wouldn't you have a problem with it if anyone else did it? Why is it that it's suddenly okay just because it's Israelites taking women and children captive, So this is something that I think, especially in light of some of the things that we've been learning concerning the nature of Scripture, the nature of canon, and the fact that, there are certain places like Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, which actually do promote slavery and even permit for masters to beat their slaves so long as the slaves do not die within 2 or 3 days. Well, that's obviously not right, and we often come to something like that from a religious perspective and say, oh, well, it's in the Bible, therefore it's the Word of God, and therefore it's okay. As if morality is decided by the Bible or morality is decided by God. And we've found that neither of those ideas are actually correct. And so, when we read stuff like this, we have to question, like, okay, is this right or is this wrong, rather than assuming one or the other. And we do the same thing. Like, here's the other thing. If we are to read it from a Roman text, let's say, we would automatically assume it's wrong. And if we read it from an Israelite text or a Jewish text, we automatically assume it's right. Well, how about let's get rid of those assumptions and let's look at each thing on its own merits. And so, in this circumstance, okay, so they're taking them captive. Well, what exactly does that entail? Does that mean that they're taking them as slaves? Well, if so, then I think it's fair to say that's bad. But if it just means that they're taking them from their own place, well, perhaps it's just an unfortunate reality of war where, okay, well, here you are, if you're destroying this city because you're battling against these people and all the men of the city are doing this, so you burn down that city, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave all the women and children there in a burnt down city with no men and, defend for themselves? Well, maybe not. Maybe the better thing to do would be to take them and integrate them into your own society and give them a better life. Well, obviously, no matter what, it would be a horrible circumstance, but maybe that would be the better out of the two options. But, I'm not trying to promote it as right or condemn it as wrong, because I don't know what the circumstances actually were. No matter what, they're awful circumstances. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is to promote two things. First, actually thinking about it, and second, thinking rightly about it. Because too often people will just avoid thinking about issues like this because, it's just too uncomfortable. That's just too uncomfortable. That's too awkward. I don't want to have to think about the fact that in the Bible, Joshua is told to go to all these different places and kill all these men, women, and children, and I don't want to have to think about, the inconsistency between my view of that and my view of a similar circumstance in any other setting. People don't want to have to face these sorts of things. But I think it's something that we can't avoid, and so I encourage people to face it, to think about it, and to think intelligently about it, rather than just, it must be like this, and try to reason it in a way that it sounds good because it's the Jewish people or whatever, or reason it in a way where, it sounds bad in these circumstances, or, like some people might say, this isn't in the Bible. I don't care if it's the Jewish people, it's not in the Bible, therefore they're doing it wrong. All of those ways of thinking about it are totally not right. And of course, even if someone was to come and immediately condemn it, I don't think that would be right either, even though that's kind of the more obvious thing to do. I think you kind of have to, what were the circumstances actually like? Perhaps in general, this type of thing should be condemned. But what if it was just between the option of just leaving them there or taking them into your society and integrating them? What if those two options were the only two options? And what if it wasn't about being mean to these women and children, but it was actually taking them and providing them with homes and this and that? Again, I'm not saying that was the case, but if that was the case, it would be wrong to condemn it without knowing what really happened. And so people should just think more carefully about issues like this. So that's basically what I wanted to advocate in regard to that. Are there any comments or questions on that aspect?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because I came off mute several times. I was going to make a comment or question and just say, well, wouldn't that have been the more humane thing to do? Because had they not taken them, they would have surely perished because they didn't have the menfolk to provide and, protect them and stuff like that. So, yeah, I can definitely see that side of it, that it's a very strong possibility that was considered the humane thing to do.
Yeah, maybe. And, there are other questions to that, though. Okay, so that may be the case once the city is destroyed, but is it necessary to destroy the city?
Well, right. Yeah, if it was wrong to take them, then it was wrong to kill their menfolk in the first place, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's kind of okay, so destroying the city, what all does that entail? And, that's not a usual, okay, I'm not saying it's not usual in the sense that it's not common. It may have been very, very common, and maybe it still is very, very common. But it seems unnecessary. If you're going to have two armies battle, well, go off in a field somewhere and battle, But to destroy a city, who knows? It's hard. It's really hard to say with the information that we have right now. Okay, was it that the army with whom they were fighting was in the city and they were using the city as kind of a defense, and the only way to defeat the army was to destroy the city? Well, if that was the case, then yeah, you can kind of see that more. How, yeah, unfortunately, this army is going to come and destroy us, so we need to destroy them. And because they're using the city as a defense, we have to destroy the city too. And, you know, in that case, well, maybe it is where, you know, the children and women, you have to do something with them. And what do? You know, you just either leave them there or you take them captive. You know, it just sounds like awful circumstances, and I really, really hate war and anything like this at all. And maybe sometimes there are no easy answers, you know. And I think that that's often the case. People always want there to be an easy answer. Oh, well, it must be this, and it's, you know. But sometimes there's just simply no easy answer. But one thing that we have to have in mind is we need to be careful. You know, we can't just create an explanation as to why it's right or why it's wrong without actually knowing anything about the real circumstances, because we could end up condoning something that is absolutely satanic, or we could end up condemning something that was the best option at the time, and we have to just be careful not to do that. So that's what I want to advocate. Let's not jump to conclusions and either justify or condemn or whatever without genuine knowledge, without valid reason. And, let's really tread carefully when it comes to subjects like these. And, you know, it's same thing in the Bible. It's like, you know, when I first realized that there are at least those two passages in the Bible which advocate slavery, and it's not a nice thing, you know, I had to be honest with myself and say, well, wait a second, am I going to excuse it and say it's okay just because it's in the Bible? How dishonest and immoral would that be of me to do? I mean, that would be absolutely immoral and absolutely dishonest. So I can't do that, you know. But I had to be careful, like, oh, wait, I better not misinterpret this. Like, what if there's something to this, or, you know, a textual variant or whatever where the original said something else. And you know, so I looked. I wasn't just, like, reckless and like, oh, well, that promotes slavery, therefore, boom, the Bible's wrong. That's what people do. They look at a couple of verses and condemn a whole library of literature just because one writer in the library happened to promote something that's wrong, even if the other people who wrote the other books perhaps didn't. But I had to give those writers the benefit of the doubt, too, to say, hey, wait a second, what if this is a misinterpretation, a mistransmission, a mistranslation? You know, there's various possibilities. And so, you know, I had to go and look it up. Like, okay, let's check a whole bunch of translations. Oh, well, they all read the same. Okay, well, let's just check a whole bunch of ancient texts. How about the Septuagint of this passage, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Masoretic text? And, oh, well, they all read the same. And all the evidence at that point stacks up on the side that this is what it actually said. Okay, well, how about interpretation? You know, is this just a misunderstanding? And you read the context and you know, all of that, and it's like, okay, well, if at the end of the day it's really promoting that it's okay to have slaves and to own other people and even to beat other people and all of that, then hey, I can't deny that that's what it says, and I have to stand in condemnation of that because it's wrong. So, you know, I hope you guys get what I'm saying, how it's like, with anything like this, we have to be careful not to just jump on one thing or another. We have to be careful to just try to understand something for what it says, try to understand the circumstances, and to really have our conclusions be in a harmony with reality.
It's like people nowadays, they judge messages. They don't even know it. They just judge it by what somebody said about it. So we got to give messages the benefit of the doubt, just like we got to give stories what people did in them, the benefit of the doubt when we don't know for sure. Don't judge.
Certainly. So we have to be able to not judge prematurely. And when we do make a judgment on something, we have to be sure to judge righteous judgment. So we should be able to look and say, hey, Hitler did some bad things, and that ought to be condemned. And that's a major understatement. And we have to understand how much of an understatement it is. Like, hey, that is awful. It's worthy of condemnation. Let us condemn it. And we should be able to look at any ancient passage, whether in the Bible or in another writing, that promotes beating slaves and say, that's awful, that's worthy of condemnation, I condemn it. So refrain or withhold our judgment until we know, and then once we know, judge righteously, either in favor or against, whatever righteousness demands.
Amen.
Well, if there are other comments or questions on this paragraph, feel free to mention it. If not, would someone like to volunteer to read the next paragraph?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Paragraph 2. Accordingly, Judas, upon considering what was fit to be done with relation to the necessity both these cases required, gave order that Simon his brother should take 3,000 chosen men and go to the assistance of the Jews in Galilee, while he and another of his brothers, Jonathan, made haste into the land of Gilead with 8,000 soldiers. He left Joseph, the son of Zacharias, and Azarias to be over the rest of the forces, and charged them to keep Judea very carefully, and to fight no battles with any persons whomsoever until his return. Accordingly, Simon went into Galilee and fought the enemy and put them to flight, and pursued them to the very gates of Ptolemais, and slew about 3,000 of them, and took the spoils of those that were slain, and those Jews whom they had made captive with their baggage, and then returned home.
All right. Any comments on that paragraph?
Well, they're reclaiming some of their people that were made captive.
Yeah, certainly.
It's interesting that their baggage was, you'd almost think their baggage would have just been, taken as plunder or whatever. But obviously it was organized and in such a way that they could keep it.
Yeah, very interesting. I thought that was kind of interesting too.
Yeah, they're really under attack. They're having to guard their borders from what was happening earlier, and now this new assault against them, coming into the city of Gilead. They're like having to split their forces and really kind of do some advanced planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of being hit on all sides. So, this is it's telling us the development of things, and I don't know if there are many more comments on that. If not, if there are, someone can make a comment. If not, would someone like to volunteer to read paragraph 3?
I got a question. I got here a little late. I don't know who you're talking about. What?
Okay. Well, essentially, there were several things that took place in the previous paragraph where basically many surrounding nations, some of them it specified and some of them it didn't, but various surrounding nations came against the Jewish people. Basically, they were uneasy with them being established again and gaining power over the temple and all of that. And so it mentioned Ammonites, and it mentioned Idumeans, and then later in the paragraph it mentioned neighboring nations, and they all came against the Jews, and the Jews had to, of course, defend themselves and fight against their enemies, and so that's kind of like the broader context of this. And let's see here.
Was that right after they reestablished the temple services?
Yep, this is right after that. So the last part of the previous paragraph was talking about the inhabitants of Ptolemais and of Tyre and Sidon, and strangers of Galilee were, quote-unquote, gotten together. And so it implies that those are, the people in those areas were assembling together to fight against the Jewish people. And so Judas, he's saying, okay, Simon, that's the brother of Judas, he would go with 3,000 men, and they would go to the assistance of the Jews in Galilee. So Tyre and Sidon, they are up north and toward the west a bit, like right on the coast of the Mediterranean. And so them and the inhabitants of Ptolemais and the strangers of Galilee, or the foreigners of Galilee, they would be attacking the Jews of Galilee. So he's like, okay, Simon, they go, and then Jonathan went to Gilead with 8,000 soldiers, and Judas went as well. So Jonathan and Judas, they went to Gilead, and then some other people were left with the rest of the forces, and they stayed in Judea to make sure everything stays safe there, and they weren't supposed to go and start any other battles. So then, of course, Simon fought the enemies in Galilee and put them to flight, and so they ended up basically, the Jews won in that circumstance. And that's kind of the last aspect that I was saying there. And then the next paragraph looks like it describes how things went with Judas and Jonathan in Gilead. So would someone like to read paragraph 3?
I will. Paragraph 3, now as for Judas Maccabeus and his brother Jonathan, they passed over the river Jordan, and when they had gone 3 days' journey, they lighted upon Nabateans, who came to meet them peaceably, and who told them how the affairs of those in the land of Gilead stood, and how many of them were in distress, and driven into garrisons into the cities of Galilee, and exhorted him to make haste to go against the foreigners, and to endeavor to save his own countrymen out of their hands. To this exhortation Judas hearkened, and returned to the wilderness, and in the first place fell upon the inhabitants of Bosor, and took the city, and beat the inhabitants, and destroyed all the males, and all that were able to fight, and burnt the city. Nor did he stop even when night came on, but he journeyed in it into the garrison where the Jews happened to be then shut up, where Timotheus lay round the place with his army. And Judas came upon the city in the morning, and when he found that the enemy were making an assault upon the walls, and that some of them brought ladders on which they might get up on those walls, and that others brought engines to batter them, he bid the trumpeter to sound his trumpet, and he encouraged his soldiers cheerfully to undergo dangers for the sake of their brethren and kindred. And he also parted his army into 3 bodies, and fell upon the backs of their enemies. But when Timotheus's men perceived that it was Maccabeus that was upon them, both whose courage and good success in war they had formerly had sufficient experience, they were put to flight. But Judas followed them with his army, and slew about 8,000 of them. He then turned aside to a city of the foreigners called Malay, and took it, and slew all the males, and burnt the city itself. He then removed from thence, and overthrew Caspham and Bosor, and many other cities in the land of Gilead.
Okay, any comments?
So he was letting them know, don't mess with me.
It's interesting that Judas has to keep coming to the rescue. Like his guys will go out and do their job or whatever, but they seem to always need his help to accomplish the goal.
Yeah, quite interesting. It highlights the fact that one person can make a huge difference. And so imagine how much of a difference it could make if you have multiple people who are willing to just, do what needs to be done in order to accomplish their mission. And I phrase it in a broad way like that because it can apply to any circumstance. But, of course, in our circumstance, it takes someone to be willing to follow the Spirit's lead and to march forward. And if we have multiple people among us who are willing to do that, well, certainly we'll change the world.
Like David's men.
Amen.
Mighty men.
One of the things that I noticed is that, some of this it's describing, battles, and he's finding out about, people being attacked, and, so he's going to help his fellow Jews and so on. And then there's, other things like he then turned aside to a city of the foreigners called Male, and took it and slew all the males and burnt the city itself. The way it describes that, it doesn't seem to be referring to, an army of foreigners. It's just a city of foreigners. He takes the city, slays the males, and burns the city itself. Again, it may just be not going into detail, and obviously it doesn't go into detail because there's only a sentence concerning it. But the way it comes across, at least, isn't really so positive. And if it was something that was, historically speaking, if what actually happened was more than just simply attacking a city, then it seems to be expressed quite poorly, because the way that it comes across is just simply attacking a city. So, it's just an observation, and I thought it's worth taking note of.
Maybe it was a preemptive strike. Maybe he had guidance from the Heavenly Family that, they needed to do this. I don't know. Just a guess.
Sure, that's a possibility worth being on the table. It's, but then you also have to question, preemptive strikes and stuff like that. Like, is that really justifiable? Is that really a good thing? Is that something that should be done? If it should be done, when is it appropriate? Just because of the nature of reality and time, and people have an opportunity to do something different. So if you condemn people and punish them for a crime that they have not yet committed, who can really say for sure that they would have? So, there's problems to be sorted out with an idea like that. So, I don't have all the answers for these questions. All I know right now is that there are questions that need to be addressed, and there are questions concerning them that we should be asking. So, that's an excellent question, and we should just think about it and contemplate it, judge it, pray about it, all of that.
Maybe Judas getting paranoid, like every foreigner to him, he was just looking at as an enemy, because obviously he had he slewed quite a few. Or then, maybe he was even, enjoying the whole, conquest thing. Again, I'm not saying that he did, but
hey, I think it's worth mentioning, like, different possibilities. One thing that I'll say is that it's certainly the case that sometimes our Heavenly Family sends a nation against another, and the nation that they sent goes overboard. I mean, that's what the Babylonians did to the Jewish people. It talks about it in Jeremiah. Like, yes, sometimes people are allowed, or the Assyrians did the same thing. Talks about this in Isaiah. Our Heavenly Family uses a nation to humble another nation, and this happened with the Jews, but then the other nation, the non-Israelite nation, would just go nuts with it and just go beyond humbling the people. They would, it would really be awful. And so I just mentioned those as examples of the fact that can happen. Whether it happened in this circumstance or not, of course, is another question, like you're saying, but those are possibilities. That sort of thing can happen.
So how long after the fact, and where did Josephus get this information from that he's writing down?
Well, this information he gets from the books of the Maccabees, and so far as I understand in this place, he is relying on First Maccabees, which is widely viewed by historians to be probably the most accurate writing of Jewish history that was ever written in ancient times.
How long was it written after the fact, do we know?
Let me see if I can find anything that gives indication. One moment. Okay, well, the last thing that it records in First Maccabees is something which took place in the year 134 BC. So, that's about 30 years after the events that we're reading about now. So, it may have been written sometime around then, perhaps just after the last events described in the book. Though it's hard to say exactly when it was written, but there's probably been historical research into that question of exactly when First Maccabees was written.
Must have been written by somebody that had some kind of, they were part of the what happened, or
not necessarily.
Or knew somebody that was part of the happening?
Again, not necessarily. Many historical writings don't, come from someone who was part of circumstances or who knew someone who was part of those circumstances. That's a possibility. I'm not trying to discount it, but I'm just saying it's not necessarily the case. Because, historians can write on whatever has happened in the past, whether it's something that they were personally a part of or not, or whether they knew someone who was a part of it or not. They probably have some sort of sources, but those sources may be oral tradition, they may be written sources, whatever it may be. So there's lots of possibilities.
Passed down somewhere or another then.
Yep.
Thank you for answering my question.
Bevakasha, or you're welcome. So, in this circumstance, of course, Judas also had victory over his enemies, so both Simon and Judas were able to have success in their endeavors. I'm looking at the time. We've been on for about an hour and 15 minutes now. Are you guys wanting to move on to the next paragraph? There are 3 more paragraphs in this section. We've read 3 this time. Tomorrow night we'll have another meeting on this. So there's a possibility, like, if we end tonight, like, let's say we end now without moving on to the next one, then tomorrow night's meeting we could go through paragraphs 4, 5, and 6. We also have the new moon meeting during the day tomorrow at noon, 12 o'clock Eastern Time. So what are your guys' thoughts?
I think that makes sense, especially in light of, just giving you some time to, recover and receive the new moon message and so on.
Yeah, it always requires study and prayer, and depending on the new moon, preparation in terms of writing things or translating things or whatever. So it'd be cool to get some sleep tonight. So, but we'll see. I may be up all night preparing anyway. But, it sounds good to me to close off. It seems like, halfway through this chapter might be a good place to stop, and hopefully we'll finish the whole chapter tomorrow night. I think it would be nice to, kind of end our reading of Josephus for this year's Hanukkah at the end of a chapter rather than partway through a chapter. And it would also be nice not to have to kind of power through a whole lot of it on the last night in order to kind of end at the end of a chapter. So that sounds good to me. So are there any last things before we close off? Or would someone like to volunteer to pray?
How many days were there in this Jewish month?
Oh, I have not gone back to count. I think there have been 30. I believe I read that on one of the new moon sighting websites.
I've been trying to keep track since the last new moon, and this was the 30th today, I think. Or maybe I'm one day off. So
yeah, I think that
new moon starts tonight.
Yeah, so we are now in the 1st. So happy new moon, everyone.
Happy new moon.
Happy new moon.
Yeah. But I think before the sun set, it was the 30th. All right, well, would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, I thank you so much for this study that you're giving us, for preserving this history for us, which is really your history and our history, and we just love you so much. I pray that we would have the integrity and gusto that Judas Maccabeus had and his brothers and the righteous people of Judah, and I pray that you would do for us and our families the incredible, give us the victories and the blessings that you gave to them for your people that are following you with their whole hearts and with all the integrity that they can muster. Give us that same bravery as we battle this battle today. And I thank you for this new moon. I thank you, Heavenly Sister, in advance for what you're going to show your prophet to your people. And we just really look forward, Sister, to what you're going to show us and prepare our hearts tonight to receive the truth. And again, bless each member of our families, those that are in the message, those that are not in the message, your hand of blessing upon them. We ask you and beg you. We love you so much. In the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
Good.
Amen.
Amen.